Robert and Margaret, inside the Great Depression, 1929. What if everything you worked for your entire life vanished in a single morning? What if the bank you trusted with every penny simply closed its doors forever? This is not fiction. This happened to millions of real people. Stay with us. This story will shock you to your core. If you are new here, please subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story like this one. It was the autumn of 1929, and Robert and Margaret had every reason to smile. Robert was a 38-year-old factory supervisor in Chicago, earning a comfortable wage. Margaret kept their modest home on the north side, warm and full of life. They had 2 children, a small savings account, and a dream like millions of other American families in that golden era. The 1920s had been electric. Between 1922 and 1929, the U.S. gross national product grew at an annual rate of 4.7%, while industrial production grew steadily and unemployment averaged only 3.7%. People felt invincible. Factories roared. Cars filled the streets. The future seemed limitless and bright. The roaring 20s roared loudest and longest on the New York Stock Exchange, where share prices rose to unprecedented heights. Robert had heard about the stock market from his colleagues at work. Everyone seemed to be making money. The banker, the milkman, even the chauffeur down the street. The public, from banking and industrial magnates to chauffeurs and cooks, rushed to brokers to invest their savings in securities, which they could sell at a profit. Robert scraped together $300, nearly 2 months of wages, and invested. It felt bold. It felt modern. It felt like the American way. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had increased 6-fold, from 63 in August 1921 to 381 in September 1929. Numbers like that made ordinary men feel like geniuses. But underneath that gleaming surface, dark cracks were forming in the foundation of the entire economy. By 1929, the U.S. economy was showing signs of trouble. The agricultural sector was depressed due to overproduction and falling prices, forcing many farmers into debt. Among the causes of the coming crash were low wages, the proliferation of debt, a struggling agricultural sector, and an excess of large bank loans that could not be liquidated. Robert noticed his factory had slowed down. Fewer orders were coming in. His manager spoke in hushed tones behind closed doors. Margaret noticed the grocery prices creeping upward. Then came the morning that changed everything forever. October 24th, 1929, known as Black Thursday, saw a record 12.9 million shares traded on the exchange in a single terrifying day. Panic had arrived. Frightened by the decline in stock prices, many stockholders began to sell their stock at once, causing the New York Stock Exchange to hit rock bottom. Robert read the newspaper headline with trembling hands. Margaret stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder, not yet understanding what she was looking at. Then came Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday. Wall Street investors traded some 16 million shares on the New York Stock Exchange in a single day, and billions of dollars were lost, wiping out thousands of investors. The Dow lost another 12% on Black Tuesday alone, closing at 198, a drop of 183 points in less than 2 months. Robert's $300 was gone. All of it, overnight. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wall. General Electric fell from 396 on September 3rd to 210 on October 29th. Radio Corporation of America. Stock plummeted from 505 all the way down to just 26. These were not just numbers. These were life savings. Okay. These were college funds. Okay. These were retirement dreams turned to ash. The crash wiped out billions of dollars of wealth in one day, immediately depressing consumer buying across the entire nation. Within weeks, Robert's factory began cutting shifts, began cutting workers. Came one cold Monday morning, the foreman handed Robert an envelope. Inside was a single week's pay and a thank you note. He had been let go. Factories were shut down. Farms and homes were lost to foreclosure. Mills and mines were abandoned, and people went hungry across the country. Margaret held her composure for the children, but at night she cried quietly into her pillow, wondering how long their savings would last and where they would go when it ran out. At the height of the Depression in 1933, 24.9% of the total workforce, 12,830,000 people, was unemployed. Robert walked miles every day looking for work. He knocked on factory doors, warehouse gates, restaurant kitchens. The answer was always the same: nothing available. Sorry, come back later. Good luck. In that terrible year, a quarter of the nation's families did not have a single employed wage earner. Only one company in 10 failed to cut pay, and in 1932, 3/4 of all workers were reduced to part-time schedules. The money ran out faster than either Robert or Margaret had imagined. They stopped buying new clothes. They rationed bread. They heated only one room of the house to save on coal. Then the bank failed. In 1930, 1,352 banks held more than $853 million in deposits. By 1931, 2,294 banks had failed, with nearly $1.7 billion in deposits lost forever. Robert had kept a small emergency fund in the local bank, money Margaret had quietly set aside for years. One morning, a handwritten note was pasted on the bank's door: closed permanently. Their emergency fund was gone. By 1933, nearly half of America's banks had failed. Unemployment was approaching 15 million people, nearly 30% of the entire U.S. workforce. Margaret went to find work. She discovered, painfully, that women faced their own impossible battle. Employers were less likely to hire married women and more likely to dismiss those already employed, believing they did not truly need the income. She finally found part-time work cleaning offices, work she would never have imagined doing before. She said nothing about it to anyone from their old neighborhood. The landlord came knocking in the spring of 1931. They were 3 months behind on rent. He was sorry, he said. He had his own debts to pay. In just 1932 alone, over 273,000 families were evicted from their homes across America. Robert and Margaret packed what they could carry and left the house they had lived in for 9 years. The children carried small bundles. Margaret held the youngest child's hand tightly, staring straight ahead. Between 1929 and 1933, in one major American city alone, over 90,000 families lost their homes. Evicted families, when they could, moved in with relatives, whole families cramming into 1 or 2 rooms. They moved into Margaret's sister's cramped apartment for adults, and for children, sharing 2 rooms and a tiny kitchen. The shame burned quietly in Robert's chest every single day. Bread lines and soup kitchens were packed, serving as many as 85,000 meals daily in New York City alone. Robert stood in the soup kitchen line for the first time in his life on a bitter January morning. He kept his hat pulled down low, terrified of being recognized by someone he knew. Unemployed people often had to rely on charity handouts and soup kitchens run by organizations like the Salvation Army. While many lost their homes as they could not afford rent or mortgage payments, across the city, shantytowns had sprung up. People called them Hoovervilles, a dark joke aimed at President Herbert Hoover. It seemed to offer nothing but false comfort and empty promises. Hooverville's shantytowns, built of packing crates, abandoned cars, and other scraps, sprung up across the nation as desperate families had nowhere left to turn. The most desperate Americans encamped on public or marginal lands in these Hoovervilles, depending on bread lines and street corners to survive another day. Robert walked past one such camp on his way home one evening and stopped. A man his age sat outside a plywood shack, cooking something thin and gray over a small fire. The man looked up and nodded. Robert nodded back. Neither said a word. The psychological toll was devastating and invisible. The effects of the Depression were not just physical. they also took a heavy toll on the mental health of the American people. As many began to lose faith in the American dream, people questioned why they were facing such hardship despite their best efforts. Many Americans felt betrayed by a system that promised prosperity but delivered widespread suffering. Robert stopped talking much. He sat for hours, staring out the window. Margaret watched him and worried more about his spirit than their circumstances. She became the quiet engine that kept the family moving forward. She stretched a pot of beans across 3 days. She mended the children's shoes with cardboard cut from boxers. She traded a winter coat for a bag of flour. She'd never complained. Not once. Not aloud. Meanwhile, the stock market continued its catastrophic descent. By 1932, stocks had lost nearly 90% of their value since the peak of 1929. The market hit bottom 2 years after the crash at 41.2 on the Dow, marking a decline of 89.2%. In less than 35 months, a dollar invested in stocks had shriveled into barely more than a dime. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 made everything worse on the global stage. Protectionist policies placed heavy taxes on imports, leading to a sharp decline in trade and devastating retaliatory measures from other countries. Farm families across America were suffering at the same level as city workers. Farm prices fell so drastically that many farmers lost their homes and land, and families split up or migrated in desperate search of work. Farm prices fell by 70%, and thousands of farmers were made homeless when they could no longer pay their mortgages. The nation was unraveling, thread by thread, family by family, dream by dream. Even industries that once seemed untouchable collapsed under the weight. In November 1929, fewer cars were built than in any other month since November 1919. By 1933, production of entire luxury automobile brands had ground to a complete halt, not to resume until 1949. In construction, the drop-off was even more dramatic. It would be another 30 years before a new hotel or theater was built in New York City. Then, in the election of 1932, the American people made a decision. They rejected Herbert Hoover and chose Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promised something radical, that the government would actually help its people. By the time FDR was inaugurated on March 4, 1933, the banking system had collapsed. Nearly 25% of the labor force was unemployed, and prices and productivity had fallen to 1/3 of their 1929 levels. FDR declared a banking holiday to stop the devastating runs on the banks and created new federal programs designed to lift the nation out of depression. New agencies were born. Jobs were created. Money began slowly, painfully slowly, to circulate again. Robert found work with a public works program, repairing roads on the edge of the city. The pay was small. The work was hard. But he came home standing straighter than he had in 2 years. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps provided jobs to unemployed youth, while the Works Progress Administration put thousands of unemployed Americans back to work in construction and public projects. Margaret continued her cleaning work, saving every spare coin. By the summer of 1934, they had enough to rent a small 2-room flat. It was nothing like the home they had lost, but it was theirs. The children grew. Robert's confidence returned in fragments. Margaret never forgot what those years felt like. The shame, the fear, the cold, the hunger. She talked about it for the rest of her life, because she believed no one should ever forget. The Great Depression profoundly altered American society. The effects were felt not only in the economy, but also in the social fabric of the nation. Farmers were forced off their land. Workers lost their jobs, and families became homeless. The psychological impact was just as severe. Americans lost faith in the economic system and the American dream, damage that would take decades to fully repair. The Great Depression lasted over a decade. It swallowed the savings, the dignity, and the dreams of millions of people who had done absolutely nothing wrong. They simply trusted a system that failed them with no warning and no mercy. Robert and Margaret survived it, but they were never the same. Nobody who lived through it was. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think a financial collapse like 1929 could happen again in today's world? Or have we built enough safeguards to prevent it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story moved you, shocked you, or taught you something new, please subscribe to our channel and share this with someone who loves history and finance. Your support means everything and helps us keep bringing powerful stories like Robert and Margaret's back to life. We will see you in the next one.